Yeah. Okay. I can send it to you. I can send you the note in a private message on Zoom. Is that all right? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anglo-Israel Association's webinar, the Israel Update, the UAE Deal Security and Domestic Challenges, with Professor Shai Feldman and Tom Gross. Professor Feldman is the president of Sapir College in Sderot in Israel, and Tom Gross is a journalist, international affairs commentator, specializing in the Middle East. Professor Feldman will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by Q&A with Tom Gross. And after that, we will open the floor for questions from the audience, which all of you can submit via the Zoom chat. So without further ado, I will pass on the screen to Professor Feldman.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you. So I will focus on the issues that Yaakov laid out, hopefully within 20-25 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. So I will begin with the breakthrough in Israel-UAE relations. And my first point will be that this is significant. This is not an insignificant development. It's a very significant development. For 3 minutes, I'll give you the historical context. Essentially, the first major breakthrough in Israeli-Arab relations, on the positive side, was of course the 1979 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty that was preceded by the Camp David Accords in 1978, which followed President Sadat's visit to Israel in 1977. The next breakthrough were the Oslo Accords. There's a hobby to speak disparagingly about the Oslo Accords, but without the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, it would have been highly unlikely that we would see the second or the next major breakthrough, which is the 1994 peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. Because of the internal domestic composition of Jordan, it would have been very difficult for Jordan to take the step that it took in 1994 without the PLO essentially legitimizing reaching accords with Israel. The next major breakthrough was the decision of the Arab League, inspired by and initiated by Saudi Arabia in 2002 to adopt the so-called Arab Peace Initiative. The reason this is significant is because it's the same Arab League that decided in 1948 to invade Palestine and essentially to launch the attempt to prevent the creation of Israel as a Jewish state. It's the same Arab League that now decided in 2002 to offer Israel a grand bargain. But the grand bargain created a new glass ceiling. Basically, the deal was the Arab world is prepared to reach, in their words, real peace, which they actually explained means normal relations with Israel, but provided that Israel meets two requirements. One, that it would return to the 1967 lines on all fronts, which also included the Syrian front, and that a so-called just solution to the Palestinian issue, and especially the refugees issue, would be implemented. And so that created a new glass ceiling, which means that Arab countries, as of 2002, peace with Israel was no longer off the table for the Arab world, quite the contrary, but it was conditioned on these two very serious conditions. Now, the beginning of the cracking of this glass ceiling actually took place 2 years ago when Prime Minister Netanyahu was invited to Oman, a first very public visit of an Israeli Prime Minister, um, which means beyond all kinds of under-the-table relations and secret visits and so on and so forth. So the Omani visit by Netanyahu was already a sign or a step towards normalization between Israel and Oman. And that was kind of an intro to what we've seen in the last few weeks, which is the breakthrough in Israeli UAE relations. So that's the historical context. It is, I think, a significant breakthrough in the same class as the previous breakthroughs. Not similar, but similarly significant. Now, it's also significant because what the rulers of UAE did essentially provides or sends a signal to the business community, not only the business community in the United Arab Republic, but the business community throughout the Middle East, because it opens also indirect ways of doing business with Israel through the business community in the UAE, if not directly, and so on and so forth. And these businessmen in the Middle East constantly look to explore what are the boundaries, how far can they go, and I think this moves the boundary significantly. So for all these reasons, I think that this is a significant development, and it's likely to be followed. When, under what conditions, and so on, it's early to tell, but it's not too wild to predict that Bahrain would follow suit, Oman, and then of course the big apple here is Saudi Arabia. For all sorts of reasons, Kuwait, I think, would be last in the list of Gulf countries that are likely to follow the UAE. So that's my first major point. This is significant. The second major point that I'd like to make is that this left the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians generally, out to dry. They feel abandoned, and it's not just a perception, it's just not just a narrative. In fact, they have been abandoned. There's been a constant process of the Palestinian issue losing its place in the Middle East agenda, losing its relative significance in the agenda of the Arab countries. And we've seen this in the very muted response to two previous steps that were taken, in this case by the US, in recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, in moving the embassy, the US embassy to Jerusalem. The reaction of Arab countries were much more muted than would have been the case 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so on and so forth. And now, essentially, another major Arab country, not major in the sense of its size, but its significance, took the step that it took, despite Palestinian objections, and a step that the Palestinians, as I said, clearly saw as abandoning their cause. So the Palestinians, first and foremost, but also others, need to ask themselves, what exactly happened here? What explains this abandonment? And as I said, this follows a process that I think began some 20 years ago, where the Middle East, where the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict lost its place in the Arab agenda. It began with 9/11, and then followed by the US-led invasion of Iraq. The focus of conflict in the Middle East essentially moved from the Arab-Israeli arena to the Gulf. The next major development was the Arab Spring in late 2010 and early 2011. And everything that followed that, especially the general turn inward of Arab governments, the survival of Arab regimes became the first and foremost objective of these regimes. And again, by inference, the relative importance attributed to the Palestinian or to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict lost its place. So we're left with this question of what exactly explains this. So partly, of course, it's the fact that the Palestinians were abandoned is partly explained by these historical developments, regional developments, as a consequence of which the conflict lost its place. But there are two developments in the Palestinian realm that explained and accelerated this process of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict losing its relative significance in the Arab countries. The first of these developments essentially is the split within the Palestinian camp, the internal division that essentially crystallized with Hamas's takeover of Gaza in June 2007, 13 years ago, more than 13 years ago. Very, very close to where I am right now. I'm talking to you from Sderot, 1.8 miles from the Gaza border. And all subsequent efforts to see a Palestinian internal domestic reconciliation have failed, including those led by Saudi Arabia. And the consequence of this sharp split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and the failure of all efforts to reconcile created a general feeling among Arab elites and Arab governments that basically said, look, if the internal conflict is more important to either Fatah on one side, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, and to Hamas in Gaza, more important than creating a common front against Israel, then why should we continue to invest what we've been investing in the Palestinian camp? So I think this issue of the internal split and the failure of all efforts at internal reconciliation has accelerated essentially this abandonment. And the second dimension of Palestinian behavior that accelerated this process is the failure of diplomacy. It's been a long time. The kind of activist diplomacy under Arafat was replaced by relative passivity. The Palestinian Authority has always waited for others to initiate, for others to offer, and for many years now have not really offered anything. And I would say that the peak of this failure is the failure of Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, to engage the Trump administration and to engage President Trump himself through this process of the Americans or the administration concocting the so-called deal of the century. The deal of the century was essentially put together without any input on the part of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, it's a very sharp contrast if you think about the last 3 years, where a regime like North Korea has engaged the Trump administration, I would say in much more activist fashion than the Palestinian Authority. That's a very long way from the Palestinians, the Fatah's and the PLO's conduct conducting itself vis-a-vis American administration during the Clinton administration. So I think all of these contributed to this defeat. My next point will be that in one sense, there is a zero-sum relationship here, which is to say the Palestinian defeat is an Israeli victory. And the victory is translating now to being able to establish the relationships with Arab countries like the UAE. However, I would say that there is also a big downside to this victory. And what I would say is that there is a paradox here, that the Israeli gain is a loss for the Zionist idea. And the reason why this Israeli gain and this Israeli victory, at least the diplomatic, if not more than that, victory, is a loss for the Zionist idea is because in this situation, where you have a continued development of relations with Arab countries, but essentially no progress, no talks, no significant negotiations to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, leaves Israel in control of the millions of Palestinians that live either in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. The result of that is not that first of all, that means the decline or the deterioration of progress towards a two-state solution and to the conflict, and that means that Israel continues to control these Palestinians without resolving this conflict, without settling the issue of political rights, and so on and so forth. And the bottom line is, if no two-state solution is implemented, if no steps are taken towards a two-state solution, then what we see is not a one-state solution, but a constant slide towards a one-state reality. And that means that, as I said, that Israel will continue to control these millions of Palestinians. There is no solution on the horizon. And if Israel indefinitely controls these Palestinians in the state that they are, then of course Israel will not be a democracy. If Israel gives these Palestinians participatory rights, then it will no longer be a Jewish state, given the demographic trajectories in the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And so for that reason, I think that a trajectory of developments in the region that leaves even less hope for resolving the conflict is not exactly something to celebrate. And coupled with that, I would say that the Palestinian issue now, without without any resolution, is not only not a cause for celebration, but the Palestinians are not going to go away. They will largely stay because many of them are trapped. Those that are trapped in Gaza, and also most of the Palestinians in the West Bank have nowhere to go as well. And trapped they will be, and they will continue, therefore, to try to get out of the current situation. Unfortunately, without creative diplomacy, the alternative is Qassam rockets and attack tunnels and explosive balloons, and so on and so forth. And on the whole, the Palestinian conflict will not go away. It will simply shift from a struggle for independence, for national rights, to a struggle over their civilian relations within the territory controlled by Israel. With the narrative, the obviously quite expected narrative that they are under an apartheid regime, and so on and so forth. So my next major point here is that this is a very positive development for Israel, but it also comes with a cost. and the cost focuses on my understanding, what my parents' understanding, what my grandparents' understanding was of the Zionist cause that brought them to Palestine, in the case of my family, as early as the 1850s. I'd like to end with comments on two issues that came up in relationship to the breakthrough with the UAE. The first has to do with the issue of annexation. So annexation was an issue, as you all know, in the weeks that led to the breakthrough with the UAE. My point will be is that annexation is, no matter how many times Israeli politicians, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, will say that he's not given up on annexation, that annexation is not off the table, it's off the table. And the reason it's off the table is because the conditions for implementing annexation, even before the breakthrough with the UAE, were quite questionable. The reason they were quite questionable is because actually there was no significant interest in Israel in seeing this annexation through. And that has and there are two reasons for that. Number one is, it simply was not at the top of Israelis' agenda over the last 6 months. To this very day, and even more so now, again, at the top of the Israeli agenda are two domestic issues. One is, as probably not very far from the UK, is the health crisis. Actually, Sderot, large parts of Sderot tonight, it's 7:26 here in the evening, has for the last almost 30 minutes has begun to be under curfew. And the curfew has to do as simply an effort to try to prevent movement and prevent the spread of the virus, but nothing to do with the threats from Gaza. So that's number one. Number two is the economic crisis, which is of course a consequence of the virus. A very small country like Israel, right now with 835,000 unemployed. So all the public opinion polls during the weeks before the breakthrough with the UAE showed that annexation was an issue for about 6% of the population, no more than 6%. So that's one reason. The second reason was that there was no significant interest group pushing for annexation. And particularly, I would say that Netanyahu's political base was completely split on the issue of annexation. Why was it split? Because half of the base basically said, yeah, we also support annexation. In that case, we joined the other half of Netanyahu's base that supported annexation, but not annexation in the context of the Trump plan, because the Trump plan, including steps that half of Netanyahu's base was vehemently against, particularly the recognition of some kind of Palestinian statehood. So even half of Netanyahu's base said, if this annexation is going to be in the context of the Trump plan, then thank you very much, we don't want it. So if even Netanyahu's base was not united behind it, then first of all, there was no significant push. And secondly, Netanyahu could abandon this without any cost, without any significant cost. And that's the situation right now. So that's as far as annexation. The last point I'd like to make is the other related issue, which is the sale of advanced weapons to UAE, which became, of course, an issue in the last few weeks since this whole issue came up. Now, I would say this, that if anybody thought that Israel could have a different relationship with the United Arab Republic, with the UAE, without that signifying particularly to members of the US Congress, that it's okay to sell advanced weaponry to the States, then someone's intelligence about US politics was definitely imperfect, I would say. It was absolutely clear that if there will be a different relationship between Israel and Arab country, it will be very, very, very difficult to block the sale of advanced weaponry. As you know, in one of the cases that is now on the agenda with respect to Prime Minister Netanyahu, has to do with the sale of German submarines to Egypt. Now, if Israel couldn't block and its interests prevented it from blocking the sale of advanced submarines to Egypt, then of course the case is even more so with the Gulf countries in the US, Gulf countries that border on Iran, and so on and so forth. So again, in this case, there is the sort of mini crisis or debate that developed in Israel after the deal was made about the issue of the sale of the F-35 stealth fighter aircraft to the UAE was actually a completely artificial debate. If Netanyahu, instead of trying to deny that he's sort of accepted the sale of F-35 as a done deal, would have simply leveled with the Israeli public and said, look, we've weighed this issue very carefully. Yes, we understand there are certain risks involved, but the gains, the advantages for Israel in a different relationship with the Gulf countries justify taking these risks, then everybody essentially in Israel would have accepted it. Netanyahu, of course, instead of that, denied that there is any kind of green light on Israel's part to the deal. And of course, everybody knows that that's not the case, that there are all kinds of green lights. Members of Congress are waiting to hear from Israel, whether directly or through AIPAC, what Israel's position is. It's absolutely clear that Israel is not going to signal at this point to go on for a fight against the transfer of these weapons. So de facto, however you want to present it and however you want to call it, Israel has given a green light. The green light for the sale of these weapons is clearly associated with the breakthrough. So that's where we are on these two issues that came to be associated with the breakthrough. One, the issue of annexation, and the second, the issue of weapons transfers to the UAE. And I can tell you that the same would happen once other Arab countries follow the UAE's example. So I will stop here, and I guess, Tom, it's your screen now.
Thank you, Professor Feldman. Thank you, Shai. I'm going to ask some questions about other issues in a moment, including Turkey, Libya, Hamas, near you, and Gaza. But just let's do a few follow-ups to the UAE deal, since you mentioned it. I'll ask 2 or 3 questions that are not, they're different questions, but I'll ask them together and then you can answer them maybe together. So first of all, from what I understand, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to Washington, and next Tuesday or Wednesday, there will be a signing ceremony for the so-called Abraham Accord with the UAE and Israel. But the de facto leader of the UAE, the Crown Prince, has chosen not to go. He's sending his brother, who's also the foreign minister. Is there some significance in this? Could it possibly be that the UAE Crown Prince is looking at the map and thinking that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu may not be in power for that much longer, and therefore he doesn't want to endorse too publicly this deal? So in other words, UAE Crown Prince is not going to be the one shaking Prime Minister Netanyahu and Donald Trump's hand on the White House lawn next week. That's the first point. The second point, vis-a-vis the advanced weapons, the F-35 fighter jets that the UAE wants, there is actually an opinion article today or yesterday by Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, who was the chairwoman of the Democratic Party National Committee, saying that the Democratic Party will try and prevent such a sale because according to US law, Israel has to maintain a qualitative military edge. So are you in fact so sure that the deal will go through, even if Netanyahu is sort of giving the green light? It doesn't mean that a democratic controlled Congress will allow this. Are you so sure it will go through? And the third point relating to your assertion that the Palestinians have been abandoned, well, in a way they've been abandoned a long time ago, but paradoxically, you have the offer this year of a Palestinian state by Donald Trump, who is a Republican, obviously a hardline Republican president, and by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a Likud right-wing Israeli prime minister, with the added bonus of $50 billion investment. So have they been abandoned? There's an offer for a state right now. And maybe that offer isn't exactly what they want and they need to negotiate changes to it, but nevertheless, there's an offer. If they want statehood, it's there. So why don't we deal with those three questions for the time being?
So this, of course, has to do with in a sense, all three questions have to do with the interaction between these developments in the Middle East and American domestic political developments, and particularly the elections on November 3rd. I think that in this sense, the UAE is playing a more sophisticated, I would say, balanced game in Washington. I'm not surprised at that because the UAE ambassador in Washington, D.C., Youssef Ateba, is one of the most able diplomats serving by any country in Washington, D.C., and this has been the case now for at least 10 years. He knows everything there is to know about American domestic politics. I would say, first of all, I would suggest that before even the breakthrough itself, that Ambassador Oteba probably tested the water with the people that are surrounding former Vice President Joe Biden about how they will accept a breakthrough that, of course, Trump will take credit for. And I think that my wild guess is that they've been given a green light. But again, it doesn't mean at the same time that they're not planning or gearing to the possibility that the results on November 3rd would go against Trump. And so what they're trying to do now is essentially they're basically doing risk analysis, and I think my wild guess is this is exactly what led to their decision about who would go to Washington, who wouldn't go to Washington. Netanyahu has been far less concerned about showing a personal association with President Trump. And the result is of course, this kind of asymmetry that may indeed be the case when this happens in Washington, D.C. Although, these kinds of things are never over until they're actually over, until you actually see who gets on a plane and who doesn't get on the plane. The issue of the F-35s and the qualitative edge, I think the American commitment to a qualitative edge is there, but there are various different ways of looking at this issue of qualitative edge. I also think that I know enough experts in military affairs in Israel that would basically say, the quality is not just the platform, but also what goes into the platform. And Israel is capable of maintaining its military edge, even if the F-35's platforms will be sold to the UAE. So that's one half. The other half is what happens. What happens after the elections. Right now, the Democratic Party is a party in opposition, and it's before an election, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz can say what she said. that's not necessarily going to be the position of a Democratic administration if Joe Biden wins the elections and the Democrats essentially take control over the administration after January 20 of 2021. So I would take what she said with a grain of salt. The third and final issue that you raised is the issue of Palestinian statehood. Well, first of all, Netanyahu, by the way, did not endorse that part of the deal. He did endorse Palestinian statehood in a famous speech he gave in Bar-Ilan University, but that's been years and years ago. In all of the messages that he's been delivering on the eve of these last 3 elections that Israel has held in the span of a year and a half, he's given every indication that, as far as he's concerned, there's no room for real statehood, whatever the name would be. But first of all, this is not the first time that even the Republican administration accepts the concept of Palestinian statehood. I mean, George W. Bush accepted the concept of Palestinian statehood, conditional, of course, about the time that the Arab League issued the Arab Peace Initiative in the speech that he gave in 2002. But of course, the kind of state and the territory that is left for the Palestinians in the framework of the Trump plan leaves very little room for real statehood. So now, but this goes back, this whole issue of the Trump peace plan goes back to the point I made earlier of the Palestinians' own contribution to at least what they subjectively see as the abandonment. They had options for affecting where the Trump plan would go. Now, would that have completely changed the direction of the Trump plan? Very difficult to say and impossible to determine because there was no real effort. The proposition wasn't tested. I think what has been tested is the hypothesis that says, very simply, you don't engage, you don't have any influence over the outcome. And I think that's where the Palestinians made a very, very big mistake.
Okay, let me just move away to some other issues now. I'm going to ask 2 questions which seemingly are not connected, but in a way they may be. The first one, since we're with the Anglo-Israel Association, I'm going to ask something about Britain. As everybody knows, Britain left the European Union at the end of January, so more than 6 months ago. Some of the people, or many of the people behind supporters of Brexit, thought that Britain would become more sympathetic to Israel than the standard European Union positions. However, since then, since Britain's left, several EU countries, the Czech Republic, Austria, Italy, and some others, are expressing more sympathetic opinions and also in actuality than the UK is. And we've got a government in Britain which, on the face of it, Conservative government, ought to be fairly sympathetic to Israel, certainly much more so than had Jeremy Corbyn won the election last year. And yet the British government isn't being that sympathetic. And I'm going to link it to a second point, which is the Iranian military nuclear program, which Israel and the Arab world are obviously very concerned about, and so many other countries. The UK has not been one of the more vociferous countries, pushing back against Iran. And are you surprised by this? Are you disappointed by this? Do you think the Israeli government is disappointed by this? Britain's been, if anything, on the more pro-Iranian regime or pro-Palestinian government wing of European countries.
Look, these are 2 quite complicated issues. I don't think they can be easily addressed in a headline or so. The second, because the issue, both of them, and especially the way you formulated the questions, have to do really with one's understanding, definition, of who is a pro-Israeli and who is against Israel. If the measure of, for example, if the measure of being not so sympathetic to Israel is measured by the positions that governments or individuals, statesmen, and otherwise take, for example, to the issue of annexation, then I would say there are at least 300 former Israeli generals that would really object to that kind of definition, to that kind of measure.
So I wasn't actually referring to annexation. There's a whole range of issues.
Yes, I know, but what came to be the measure? If you look at the last 6 months, what came to be the measure of whether you're on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of whether you're sympathetic or not sympathetic? On the Israeli-Palestinian front, the most significant issue that became a public issue is the issue of annexation. There are a million other issues between Israel and the Palestinians, but they didn't have the salience over the last 6 months. So whether we like it or not, that became a kind of a litmus test to where you are on this issue. And yes, there are people that were, and leaders in Europe that were, more vehement in their opposition. And I'll give you a very good example here, in my view, Angela Merkel. Merkel has been adamantly against annexation, adamantly against annexation. Is Merkel anti-Israeli? Is Merkel...
But I wasn't, sorry to interrupt because we haven't got so long. My question is not about annexation, which, by the way, I personally never thought was really going to happen. It was a negotiating ploy, maybe in coordination with the Trump administration and the UAE, to give the UAE an excuse to do what they long wanted to do, which is to recognize Israel. I just meant the language in general coming out of the British Foreign Office has been pretty hostile towards Israel on a range of things. Whereas, I know that European diplomats from Central Europe and Eastern Europe have been quite surprised by that Britain is, not more sympathetic in tone, or rather, this particular government. Had the government had Jeremy Corbyn won, of course, it would be something different.
I didn't intend for my answer to be critical of any of your, and I generally don't take questions as being, critical or not, and so on and so forth. I didn't mean to respond to anything that you may have implied, or I didn't want to attribute any implication or anything like that. I just said that these issues are complicated issues. To deduce where countries are going by foreign ministry statements, that's another issue that's complicated. I mean, we've had a situation over years and years and years where statements coming out of foreign ministries were not terribly sympathetic. At the same time, the same countries had very, very, very close defense cooperation with the Israeli Defense Forces and so on and so forth. We may have critical statements coming out of governments that engaged in joint exercises with the Israeli Navy, with the Israeli Air Force, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. And the same thing applies to Iran, because, the issue of where, to take the issue of what your position is with respect to the nuclear agreement, as an indication of whether you're, pro-Israeli or against Israel, is very complicated. Of course, Netanyahu would have a very clear definition. For him, the Iranian nuclear issue is an existential issue, but also it also has to do with a strategic judgment as to whether the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, is good or bad. Now, that's, of course, a subject of a major debate. It's a subject of a major debate in the heart of the Israeli defense community. There are many people in Israel that are saying, okay, now the US under Trump, because it's both pro-Israeli and anti-Iranian, have taken the US out of the JCPOA. Are we in a better state now than we were 3 years ago in our relationship with the nuclear project in Iran? And they would have said, and there are some people that say this in the Israeli defense community, with all the shortfalls, with all the difficulties of the JCPOA, the questions were always, even then, the issue is, okay, if you get out of the JCPOA, what replaces it? Now, what has replaced it? Nothing's replaced it. So the Iranians have gone back to enrichment, reprocessing, and so on and so forth. and no one's offered a compelling story about how, okay, now how do we stop it? So it's very complicated to take these issues as measures of whether you're pro or against and so on. That's my only point.
Okay, let me just gravitate away to another issue. Some people suggest that actually the Iranian nuclear program, there's maybe too much concentration on that, and we or Israel should look more carefully about Turkey as a growing problem, particularly in the East Mediterranean, but just in general. I mean, it's obviously incursions into Syria, it's playing around in Libya with its military support for one of the factions, one of the sides there, and so on. In the longer term, is it possible that Turkey is at least a bigger threat to Israel, obviously depending on the government in Turkey, but if it's a hostile government, is it possible that Turkey is at least as big a threat in the longer term as Iran is? Is that possible?
You know, the way I would look at this is to ask, you know, to what extent Turkey is a major security challenge for Israel, without trying to compare it to Iran. It's apples and oranges, and so I don't want to get into that. Is Turkey a significant challenge for Israel? The answer is unequivocally yes. The fact of the matter is that the best indication of that is Israel is now, there's of course, you know, in the Middle East, just as in the case of the breakthrough with the UAE, their positive developments are often associated with some costs, with some downsides. In the case of the conflict with Turkey, there are also upsides for Israel because of the threat that Turkey is now projecting not only at Israel. I mean, everybody's been focusing on the last few years on the common interest that Israel has with Egypt over stabilizing the situation in the Sinai, which is a serious problem for Egypt, serious problem for Israel. But I would say it's more a problem at the operational level. Turkey is a problem for Egypt and Israel at the strategic level. And it's not accidental that we have a different kind of relationship in the Mediterranean Sea between Israel and Egypt in the context of essentially the Turks trying to project themselves into the new battlefield of the Middle East, which is energy in the Mediterranean, okay? And Israel exercising with the Greek Air Force. Now, what is this? This is essentially a containment strategy. There is common interest now between Israel and Greece to contain a country that's a member of NATO, Turkey. So we're in a very different arena here, and when you know the Middle East is a much more complicated arena than it was when I was a soldier more than 40 years ago. Much more complicated arena. I mean, if you look at the number of players, including Turkey, that have a role in determining the future of Syria, it's you know, this is a different Middle East. It's not the Middle East, as I said, of 40 or 50 years ago when Israel had one adversary. It was called Syria. Israel had one address to deter, which was called the regime in Damascus. Now, essentially, you're forming and reforming coalitions in this theater of operation called Syria every day. And look at the number of players that are playing in the Libyan theater of operation now. So, and Turkey, again, it's projecting itself into Libya, and it's in competition with Egypt in Libya. So yes, Turkey is a major problem for Israel. I wouldn't compare it. I don't think there's any utility in comparing it to the issue of Iran. All it means is that Israel, this is a Middle East in which Israel is constantly looking for allies because nobody on his own can solve and address these issues. Israel will look for allies, will continue to look for allies in the Gulf, and it will look for allies in other places. Because, again, because we've got challenges from Turkey, from Iran, and so on and so forth. And we haven't even spoken about Russia, which is a very complicated story for Israel, because Russia is playing a very, very delicate balancing act. The Syrian arena offered in the last few years an opportunity, 1,000 opportunities for a major incident between Israel and Russia. It was avoided partly, if not largely, because of, first of all, because both Israel and Russia have complicated interests, but also because this is where personalities are also important. There's been a personal rapport between the Israeli Prime Minister and President Putin. It has lots of downsides, but also one major important upside is that both of them gave directions to the military establishments, one in Israel, one in Russia, to form all kinds of understandings, tactical understandings, to avoid essentially escalation where it's not needed, and so on and so forth. So somebody said, this is not your grandfather's Middle East. It's a much more complicated Middle East, and it therefore requires a lot of finesse. And that's kind of the answer that I gave you as far as the UAE and how it's going to approach the issue of the ceremony next week. It knows that it's operating in a very complicated arena. It has to constantly pursue balancing acts, including in Washington.
So let me just ask you a follow-up to that and one other question. I'll put them together. First of all, the follow-up. Whatever one thinks of Benjamin Netanyahu, as you just pointed out, he has been quite skillful in getting a personal rapport with President Putin, also with President Trump, Modi of India, and some others. Is there any other likely candidate for Israeli Prime Minister, either within the Likud or on the right, like Bennett, or more on the center, like Gantz or Lapid or somebody else, who you think will be able to pretty quickly assume that same kind of understanding and rapport with, let's suppose that Trump's re-elected. So let's suppose Netanyahu either loses an election or he's, he has to forced to resign because of the ongoing trial. Which other Israeli leader could skillfully deal with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and others? That's the first question. And I'll just ask the second one because we're about out of time, because I don't want to miss this. You, of course, are president of Sapir Academic College near Sderot. You're speaking to us from Sderot. Very nearby in Gaza, Hamas are still in control. They fire rockets basically when they want to. Israel responds up to a point, but not decisively, and it seems there won't be any change in that. So in other words, you're a little bit at the mercy of the mood of Hamas. A few years ago, there were suggestions, to build an independent port in Gaza and so on. So the first question is there another Israeli leader that has the skill set to deal with those international leaders so smoothly as I think Netanyahu has done? And the second question is, how is it as a human being, as a feeling with your students as well, to be in and around Sderot and deal with this constant threat of projectiles, rockets, balloons, the rockets disguised as balloons, and so on?
So on the first question, I would say it's impossible to answer this question until in fact somebody else steps in. Again, one of my memories from being a young soldier in the late 1960s was that nobody believed that President Nasser of Egypt, with his stature, with his charisma, with his firing speeches that went over the heads of Arab leaders and touched the soul of publics in Lebanon and Jordan and so on and so forth. A leader that was so charismatic that by the exercise of soft power, in his case, soft power was the power of speech, not the power, not the financial power, which Egypt never had. And nobody saw around him who could replace him. And intelligence agencies throughout the world in the late 1960s, when it came to assessing his vice president, Sadat, spoke and wrote disparagingly about Sadat as somebody who can't possibly step into to the foot of somebody of the stature of President Nasser. And of course, Sadat proved himself one of the greatest grand strategists of the period. I can give you another 3-hour lecture about that, but I will resist. So it's very, very difficult. Does Israel have capable leaders who could step in? The answer is yes, even within the right. I mean, both Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman are two very impressive individuals. Who would have the same, has the same stature right now in the center and the left? I would say the center and the left in Israel is suffering from a leadership crisis right now, and it's been going on for quite a number of years. It's not different from the problem of the center and center left in Europe. I mean, how many Macrons are there in the European continent right now? And but your assessment of Netanyahu is accurate. Netanyahu had the ability to forge very close personal relationships in the region as well, especially with President Sisi. Of course, some of the, personally, I would say some of the close relationships that he was able to develop, I would have preferred that Israel would not necessarily be associated with one or two individuals, especially the present leadership of Hungary. I'm not very happy to see an Israeli prime minister associate himself with leaders that have no inhibitions against utilizing anti-Semitic symbolism in their debate. But there's no question about Netanyahu's talents on this front. Now, the issue of Hamas, of course, this is a challenge here. It's a challenge for a college that has. I'd like to say that the fact that even if the college that I am presiding over was a mediocre college, even in that case, the fact that 8,200 students travel to Sapir College when we don't have a curfew because of the virus, or because we're in summer vacation, travel to the college every day. Hundreds of professors travel to the college every day. Would have been a miracle. As I said, even if the college was mediocre. The college is a miracle because, in fact, it's an excellent college. It has a superb law school, a superb school of social work, a superb film school, one of the best in the country. And a superb school of communication, and other departments are also great. Now, is it not challenging to be located 1.8 miles from the border when you don't know when exactly Hamas will figure that it serves its purposes to launch or to permit the launching of Qassam rockets or explosive balloons, and so on and so forth, is a different. But you see, again, this is where the Middle East is complicated, because it's not the 1950s when Israelis were naive enough to think that these kinds of issues have a military solution. There's no military solution here, because the cost of reinvading Gaza is controlling the daily life of these millions of Palestinians. So what does it mean? It means that Israel, first of all, has an interest in calm, is just quiet. Have the Hamas stop rocket launching and stop permitting balloon launching and so on and so forth. So Israel finds itself in a situation where, but at the same time, both in the defense community and outside the defense community, there is a recognition that the living conditions in Gaza are intolerable, and that Israel has an interest in permitting at least the situation in Gaza of moving from intolerable to at least barely tolerable. And that means a lot. It means in terms of what goes into Gaza, it means what kind of how we deal both with the health crisis. I mean, Israel has a clear interest, because you know, a complete explosion of the virus in Gaza would be detrimental to Israel, because right now there is Palestinian labor moving into Israel from Gaza and so on. Same situation in the West Bank. So Israel has an interest in a degree of well-being in Gaza, and so you found yourself in a situation where, in the midst of or because of the last escalation, especially escalation in the use of explosive balloons, Israel essentially lobbied Qatar to renew its cash transfers to Gaza. I say to Gaza because it's a facade. Of course, who is in Gaza except Hamas? So this is, again, it's not your grandfather's Middle East. I mean, the fact that the Israeli defense community was associated with encouraging Qatar to deliver cash to Gaza tells you that, you know, the delineation between good guys and bad guys is very complicated today.
Just, if you've got a little more time, just two things. Yesterday, I believe Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which of course is Shia, Hamas is Sunni, they both dislike Israel, to put it mildly, but they don't tend to cooperate, as far as we know, that much. And yet they had a sort of meeting, publicly declared meeting yesterday to discuss the UAE deal. Should Israel be concerned about future greater cooperation between Hamas and Hezbollah? And then an entirely separate question. I can see that Martin Green, who's one of the, I know him personally, and he's very much associated with the Anglo-Israel Association. He's asking, is there a possibility of a trade agreement within the wider Middle East leading to some kind of common market in the region? So two completely different questions there.
On the first question, it's easy to answer. Israel is watching very carefully all of these developments, and it's it's agile. The Northern Front is very complicated. It's very difficult for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. You have essentially chaos and anarchy in Syria, and everybody's playing the Syrian arena. Iran tries to continue to support in the way it can Hezbollah as a way of a broader regional balancing act against Israel. So yes, and now in a situation in which the number of countries in the Middle East that are standing in line to volunteer to support Hamas is declining, then it's not really surprising that Hamas also is looking for allies wherever it can find them. And right now, the only ally that they can find, to some extent, is Hezbollah. But for all the reasons you mentioned earlier, it's very complicated. The northern arena is now much more strategically is much more dangerous to Israel than where I am right now. And Israelis have common sense. So even the people that are now my neighbors in Sderot and the Shara Negev region and the Western Negev and so on, who have been essentially on the receiving end of Qassam rockets and explosive balloons, they also at the same time understood why the Israeli Defense Forces cannot concentrate on this arena, because the threats in the north are much more serious, much more strategic than what we see here. I mean, Hamas, in the end of the day, with everything that it can launch, is contained. It's contained within very clear boundaries. It's contained within very clear sets of fences and so on and so forth. The situation in the north is much more fluent. Many more players, many more capable players are playing that game. And therefore, anything that has to do with the Northern Front receives a lot of attention. So
let me just quickly ask you before we go to the trade question about the North. As everybody knows, there was that horrendous explosion in Beirut port. Before that, even there were daily demonstrations. There's an economic crisis in Lebanon. Lebanon has never been a very cohesive state, but it really seems to be imploding. Does this weaken Hezbollah that dominates Lebanon, or might Hezbollah lash out at Israel as a way of distracting from these increasing problems within Lebanon.
Look, I would say two things about this. One is Hezbollah has a big problem right now in Lebanon because there's a lot of anger in the Lebanese street. And we have to remember that Hezbollah, like Hamas, is not just a terrorist organization. It's also a political movement. And so it cannot be deaf to the sounds of the street. It's not accidental that after the 2006 explosion between Israel and Hezbollah, Nasrallah had to go to the airwaves and apologize to the Lebanese people for making the mistake that he made in miscalculating how Israel would respond. Why? Because he couldn't ignore the street. So yes, Hezbollah has a big problem right now. I would say that because the explosion that you mentioned in the port was only the last in a series of developments that caused a problem for Hezbollah in the street. I think that right now the mood in Lebanon is that if Hezbollah, and I think Nasrallah is smart enough and has enough sensors in the Lebanese street to avoid the mistake that you indicated, which is to say, lash out at Israel. Because in this situation right now, lashing out in Israel would be interpreted in the Lebanese street as an artificial effort to move the attention away from Hezbollah and the irresponsibilities of its conduct within Lebanon to the Israel issue. Now, again, this is where everything's changed. If this was 30 years ago, where the Arab-Israeli conflict had the salience that it had, then, of course, Arab leaders from time to time used the Arab-Israeli conflict to sway attention away from their domestic problems. In Lebanon today, this wouldn't work, in my view, and I think Nasrallah knows that it's not going to work. So he's playing a very delicate game. He's trying to at least show that he's still loyal to the Palestinian cause, to the general Arab cause, but he's very, 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 very careful. He knows sometimes he makes mistakes, as all leaders do, and he tries to correct the mistakes as he can. And in that sense, he's quite. Now I no longer remember your second question.
Okay, the second question, which was from Martin Green, is whether there's a possibility of trade agreements in the, I guess, in the Sunni Arab world and Israel, leading to some kind of common market. I might just add, of my own opinion, that clearly the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and also UAE know that oil and gas is not going to last forever, and they need desperately to reform their economies. So, will we see much greater trade across the region?
But these are two different questions. Their perception of whether they can depend on oil indefinitely fits into the equation of why they're interested in Israeli technology. So the answer is, on this question is easy. It's yes. The question that Martin asked is a very different question, which is, are we seeing the conditions created for the creation of some kind of a common market in the Middle East? And my answer is definitely no. Because, and this has, again, it has very little to do with the attitude towards Israel. It has to do with the relationship between these various Arab countries. I mean, we've seen essentially the split in the same Gulf arena, the effort of Saudi Arabia and the UAE to contain what they, in their perception, was dangerous Qatari behavior in the region. Not only did it split Gulf countries between Qatar and on one side, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the other side, but it also demonstrated the limits of Saudi power and Saudi influence, because the fact of the matter is that they haven't succeeded in essentially forcing a kind of a Qatari surrender. Qatar continues to play. It plays everywhere. It plays, as I said, in Gaza. It plays in other arenas, like supporting in Libya, elements within Libya that compete with the Saudi-supported elements, and so on and so forth. And so you have a country like Oman that's watching this conflict between Saudi Arabia and UAE on one side and Qatar on the other side, and it's taking a neutral position. And it's basically saying You're all at fault here. You're wrecking any sign of Arab unity, and we're not taking part in this. We think this is a big mistake. And they thought that that's a big mistake of Saudi Arabia to get involved in the way it got involved in Yemen. So there's a big debate among those countries about the so-called Yemen adventures. So the idea that somehow this would go beyond a set of bilateral breakthroughs that Israel is going to have, and it will have, with countries, with an increasing number of countries, but that this would somehow morph into a common market in the Middle East, or even a common trade market in the Middle East? No.
Okay, let me just ask you one more question. I don't know how much more time we've got, but a slightly separate question about Arab attitudes to Israelis and Jews and so on. Obviously, I don't want to generalize too much. There are hundreds of millions of Arabs, but I speak quite a lot privately to people from many Arab countries. And some of the negative things they say about the Palestinians are almost shocking. They're stronger than the Israeli right is saying about Palestinians. So increasingly one hears these in public. I'll read you just a little extract from an article in the Saudi Gazette published 2 days ago. He says, Palestinian politicians have, for the last 60 years, have sabotaged negotiations and rejected all peace initiatives, whether those presented by Israel or other international parties. The Palestinian politicians did this at their, so I'll just skip a bit. So the intransigent attitude has, well, sorry, you know what, I'll just sum it up to be quicker. He's essentially saying they're intransigent because they wanted to pocket all the money that came in from European governments and also from the Arab world. And basically, he's blaming the Palestinians for the fact there hasn't been peace with Israel, which is similar to the position of the Israeli right or the Israeli center. I increasingly hear this from diplomats. I've heard it from Bahrainis, Saudis, Iraqis even. Admittedly, the people I speak to may be the more sophisticated ones, but nevertheless, they're the opinion leaders in these countries. Do you think there's been a sea change where they're just, it's not, they're really just completely fed up with the Palestinian cause? And as you said at the beginning, the Palestinians are being abandoned, and this will be an increasing trend where they won't even pay lip service anymore to the Palestinian cause. And the second follow-up to that is President Abbas is old, he's in his 80s. Will a successor, a younger successor, be able to, you know, seriously negotiate a deal with Israel? Again, they might get less than they were offered in the past by people like Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, but nevertheless, maybe Abbas is the obstacle, and maybe once the Palestinian Authority sees they really have very little support in the Arab world, they'll have no choice but to cut their losses, so to speak, and take what they can get in forms of a state from Israel.
I have to confess that I don't really understand the first question, because the first question is simply a restatement of everything that I said in the beginning. Yes, the Palestinians have been abandoned, and for those reasons that you mentioned. And
no, what I was saying is there's more public, the kind of, I've read several articles since the UAE deal in several countries, which presumably with the blessing of the various governments and regimes, it's a more public abandonment.
Yes.
They've never been that supportive as they claim,
yes.
but
yes.
they may just completely give up supporting them financially as well, apart from odd cases like Qatar for a little bit in Gaza. And their only real allies left will be the Iranian regime, up to a point President Erdogan in Turkey, European leftists, and maybe leftist Jews.
Well, you have a better crystal ball than I have. This is a very complicated region, and to predict what the next steps will be, I think is beyond what I'm willing to do. I think that yes, the most important thing is to understand that there is increasing criticism of the Palestinians. It partly has to do with, as I said, with the Palestinian passivity, for all the reasons I mentioned in the first 25 minutes. So I won't reiterate that. And that's also my answer to the second question, because who knows? You know, again, I mean, nobody saw how the change of regime in in Egypt after Nasser's death would turn up. Bashar Assad comes to power, and everybody says, oh, he's an eye doctor. He came from some hospital in the UK. What does he know about ruling a country? Then the Arab Spring begins, and Israeli leaders, including the former Prime Minister Barak, said, oh, his days are numbered. Within weeks, the regime will go away. Well, it's now been almost 10 years, 9 years of a very difficult civil war, and somehow he's managed. Then King Hussein dies, and King Abdullah comes, and everybody says, well, what experience does he have? And so on and so forth. He turns out to be almost as gifted as his father in being able to manipulate and to maneuver in this Middle East. So to know who will succeed Mahmoud Abbas, great. I can't find any unity in the American media about who is going to win on November 3rd. So we try to predict what will happen after Mahmoud Abbas dies. That's again beyond my pay grade.
Well, thank you so much for both of you, Shai and Tom Gross. Thank you very much for both of you for excellent presentation and great questions. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it at that. Thanks for everyone who's joined us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you all in our next event.
Thank you.
Good night to everybody.
Thank you.